Hi, everybody. My name is Tony Lambert. I am a senior malware analyst here at Red Canary. And today, if you're joining the webinar, we're going to talk a little bit about crypters and loaders. And I'm joined by Alex and Joe, some wonderful people to go on this journey of learning, and hopefully you take away something awesome from this. There's a lot of things you can do today. Thanks for spending some of your time with us. Let's talk about the stuff that we're going to talk about today. We're going to do a quick intro so we can learn a little bit more about Alex and Joe. We're going to talk about defining crypters and loaders. What are they? Why do we care about them? What role do they play in a larger malware ecosystem? We want to know how adversaries use these tools. If we're going to detect a problem, if we're going to run after it, we need to understand what the problem is. So that's going to be a lot of what we cover today. And then finally, what can we do about crypters and loaders? They're a really fundamental part of this malware ecosystem. We want to know, what can we take action on here? All right, so I will kick it over to Alex and Joe for introductions.
Hey, I'm Alex DeLamotte. I am a senior threat researcher at SentinelOne on the Sentinel Labs team. I focus primarily on Linux, cloud, and Android threats. Joe?
Hi, I'm Joe Slowik. I currently lead CTI functions for the MITRE ATT&CK project, which I'm guessing a few people in the audience are probably familiar with. In addition to that, I also do a lot of critical infrastructure security research and analysis for MITRE and others. So yeah, thank you for having me.
And with that, I believe we can jump on into the crypter stuff.
Sounds good. So crypters are tools, techniques, or methods that adversaries leverage to encrypt, obfuscate, or otherwise modify malicious code to evade detection technologies. In other words, to make it a little more effective for them to slip past detection measures. There are different types of crypters. They're commoditized evasion for malicious consumers, meaning packing, obfuscating, and encrypting of payloads to ensure that they are not detected. There are two different types. They can be built at runtime, like delivering payloads in pieces or copying them together, as opposed to the static crypters that are designed to hinder AV signature analysis. Loaders?
Yep, so loaders are a type of malware that's really just intended to deliver additional payloads. So a means to an end for an adversary to get to their actions on objectives, whether that be an information stealer, a crypto miner, or maybe most concerningly, a bit of ransomware, although you can see links between these items and live intrusions. So in looking at these items, we're really emphasizing a mechanism that is designed as an initial access payload that gets an adversary in place to deliver something else, whatever it is that they want to achieve within that victim environment. What's interesting, though, is that from an e-crime perspective, we often see this operating under an affiliate model, like we've seen with the sort of Cambrian explosion of various division of labor in the cybercrime ecosystem. Loaders will be used to broker access to systems so that another entity can then deploy their ransomware payload, their info stealer, etc., with that access provided by another party. As such, this is a crucial component of the malware ecosystem in really fueling a lot of the subsequent activity. And thus, if we can detect and mitigate against loaders, we can presumably prevent a lot of other bad outcomes by interrupting the flow of adversary activity before adversaries are able to get into a position of handing that access off to a bad actor or leveraging that access to deliver a concerning payload. So with that, any questions so far? Trying to look at the Q&A box here.
So we'll start off with kind of one where a question we very commonly get from folks talking through loaders and crypters, kind of asking how adversaries use them, like exactly at what point do loaders and crypters start and stop, and how do adversaries use this together with rats and stealers? And some of the stuff where we've seen in the past of like, a lot of times adversaries will just buy these products, right? Like they'll absolutely do this stuff of like, they'll go online to a a sketchy marketplace, pay $20 for a cryptor or $20 for a loader, pay $20 for their stealer, combine them together and then see what you get. And that's really what, that really tends to be what we see the most of how those two get used together. Is that y'all's experience as well? Awesome. Sweet. And so there was one question, what info stealer is least detected? So that one, we could probably think about a little bit and go on towards us one of the later question sessions, because I know that's a good one. That's good to stoke thoughts on as we go. All right, well, I guess we can.
Well, there's a question that just popped up actually from Mr. Edwards. Do loaders typically come with their own packers and cryptors? And I think that's an interesting question. Tony, Alex, you might be a little bit more able to answer this because you're closer to actual operational data than I am over in MITRE land. But again, looking at this as an affiliate model, there is a lot of plug and play that comes into existence when it comes to these items. So I'm not sure if you guys could share anything that you've seen in your respective roles.
A little bit, yeah. What I've ended up seeing a lot more is where I talk about loaders coming with their own packages. It's what I end up seeing is almost like an as a service offering sort of thing, where a adversary will offer an interface where you can upload whatever executable you have, and then it'll spit out a cryptid or something else executable that does all the loading for you. So it's almost like a self-service thing, but instead of getting a self-service password reset or something like that, it's a self-service, like, submit your own content and it gets encrypted. Awesome.
Okay. Shall we press on?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. So looking at this, roughly, why do we care? Because cryptors and loaders are prereqs for bad things. Am I handing this over to you here, Tony, or am I continuing?
You're good to go through the MITRE stuff.
Okay, that's what I figured. So in looking at this, we see that a lot of malware is reliant on cryptors to evade detection. As Alex noted earlier, that this is a way to avoid static analysis and static detections by masking, hiding, or otherwise obfuscating content from being visible to some sort of tool or detection mechanism. What's interesting is that sometimes this also comes with a licensing requirement of some sort that requires that items be deployed or used in certain ways so that the entities coming up and developing and selling these cryptors can maintain their product line basically for a longer period of time, which is interesting to think about, that you see actual business models emerging from these ecosystems. Loaders, in turn, often mean wider successful distribution of follow-on tools. We've certainly seen this in terms of things like deploying info stealers, which, while they're not immediately impactful in terms of how they affect the environment, we certainly have plenty of cases where captured credentials have been leveraged in future intrusions after they get sold or resold elsewhere to then facilitate future campaigns leading to ransomware and elsewhere, with these sorts of actions allowing for that to spread far further. To the degree that analysis of these items can allow us to burn adversary tools and infrastructure, there's a very beneficial aspect to this in that burn one of these and potentially impact multiple, handful, dozens, etc., of affiliates that are reliant on these models, and force adversaries to go back to the drawing board to try to change what it is they're doing and come up with something that could evade new detections or identifiers for the payloads that they are pushing. So very much an area of interest and a place where having some level of understanding and investing some effort and not just knowing how these items function, but also how to identify them, which we'll get to, can be quite beneficial. But since I'm the attack guy, what's this got to do with MITRE ATT&CK? How does crypto or loader activity map to attack tactics and techniques? Well, it these are critical sort of support functions that, if we start looking at the attack matrix, really file into defense evasion as well as some other areas of the overall matrix. So we can see in defense evasion a variety of areas where crypters will come up in terms of deobfuscating or decoding files or information, depending upon how they're delivered and how they're put together, but also a variety of ways of obfuscating payloads and creating them on victim machines in, again, various formats to evade static detection and analysis. So everything from padding binaries, different ways of packing or crypting software, from commodity publicly available tools to the variety of custom cryptors that we see sold in interesting markets and so forth, and various ways of interacting with payloads to make them either something that gets assembled at runtime or something that is decrypted or deobfuscated as part of the execution process. And when it comes to loaders, what's interesting about these items is that they are tools that are transferred into the environment on their own or delivered in some fashion, but then also serve as a critical function of facilitating follow-on ingress tool transfer, T1105. So being able to bring in your next payload or your actions on objectives payload, like a crypto miner or the info stealer that actually is doing the work that is desired by the adversary. So we're really living in these areas in terms of loaders facilitating this tool transfer and cryptors operating to really drive defense evasion from a lot of anti-malware and similar solutions. So we do have a question that came up. Are there certain cryptors and loaders only used by specific groups or APTs to the point they can be considered group signatures, or is that not really a thing and instead everyone is using the same popular tools here? That is interesting from an attack perspective, actually. And looking at sort of the broad view of industry, there are certainly custom ways of crypting payloads that we see APT entities or whatever utilize that really are unique to however they're deploying software, and that factors into a lot of the identification of how these groups function. But then, there's also plug and play in terms of the availability of certain tools, whether we're talking about fairly classic items for crypting or packing a piece of software like a VM Protect, all the way to the more criminal items. I'm curious, and I'll turn it over to Tony and Alex if you guys have anything better to offer than I do.
One thought that comes to mind is on the cryptor side, when you're packing your payload, we see a lot of sharing. I'm sure there is bespoke crypting happening out there, but the goal with your initial payloads is usually to remain under the radar and kind of skew obfuscation or attribution if you're an APT actor. Whereas with loaders, I think they're a little more likely to use something bespoke. So that's where we get into the more, customized category, where they wouldn't just be using some publicly available tool.
That's something along the lines I was thinking. The loader part makes me think back to like the SolarGate, like the SolarWinds stuff from years back, whenever like they use custom Cobalt Strike loaders and things like that, where a lot of groups will have their own loaders that they'll share around for, specific tooling necessarily that might, but like as the tooling changes a little bit, maybe their loader changes. That reminds me a lot of that. Awesome. Well, let's go ahead and barrel on forward to what some of the cryptors look like in the wild. And wanted to include this, and the telemetry that you're going to see here is endpoint telemetry that's been captured with EDR sensors. Not all of these cryptors and loaders, not all of them that you see in the wild produce behaviors that can be seen with endpoint sensors, but a decent amount of them do. And we like to kind of term them as like, you've seen those, videos of Rube Goldberg machines of like, the more moving parts something has, the easier it is for things to go wrong. And it's somewhat of a similar phenomenon that happens with cryptors. There's some families like Cypher IT here, where they do have encryption going on in different components, but as part of their defense evasion, they like to deliver components in piecemeal. And so what we've ended up seeing a lot with Cypher IT is that they have auto IT payloads and executables that they deliver, but they chop them up into chunks. And that's pretty much what is happening in the first part of the screenshot at the top left, where they have delivered their auto IT stuff all in chunks, and they're using a copy command to stitch all of them together at runtime so that they can get all of their executable together. And then immediately afterwards, they'll execute it and launch whatever auto IT script was delivered alongside the actual executable. And kind of how we've talked about how it's almost like a mix and match sort of endeavor of like, you can have one crypter be seen with multiple payloads, and you can have, one payload seen with multiple crypters. It's a very much choose your own adventure story sort of experience. In this particular case, this was probably in the last month, we saw an instance of Cypher IT delivering both Luma Stealer and Net Support Manager in the same thread where it was being dropped to disk. And in the screenshot that we have here, the gambling.pif, that was all part of the auto IT portion. After everything was stitched together, the command line there ending in E was the script content. Inside that script content was like RC4 encrypted content. And then as things progressed, it started touching browser-related files, exhibiting Stealer activity. That was the stuff where it would pass off control to Luma. And if you're the average, odd person going and looking through some of this, when you start looking through some of this activity, it's not really obvious the Stealer activity is happening. If you're looking at this from a network perspective, if you have PCAP data network telemetry, delivery in this piecemeal fashion often gets past that where it's not as obvious. So this is definitely something that we see quite a bit. And the second one that I wanted to bring up from the Windows side for crypters is Scrub Crypt. We've seen this again in the last few months where in this case, Scrub Crypt likes to deliver its executables, its content in batch scripts. And so inside, if you take a look at the batch script, there's a few commands at the top, and then further down, there's a bunch of encoded/encrypted data. So the first few lines are readable, and then it's a just, mess at the bottom that's unreadable. And what it does is it starts doing things like renaming PowerShell so that it can do a little bit of defense evasion, and then it will start issuing PowerShell commands. And that's what we have going here for our first little bit of screenshot. In this case, our Scrub Crypt batch file was delivered as a masquerading as a tax document. So you can probably tell, this was somewhere around the March to April timeline in the US. And as things progressed, they started executing additional PowerShell code. Again, it's sort of rough to read, but when this code boils down, it does a decryption process. It cuts out a chunk of code out of that batch script, does a little bit of decryption, and then loads it in using .NET Reflection into PowerShell. And this sort of thing is really common among .NET crypters. This is something that's fairly easy to commoditize across multiple threats. So all that said, I know, we have a little bit of content in here for Linux, but we don't have as much for Mac. And there's a pretty good reason for this. Crypters aren't really as common on the macOS side. On the macOS side, when we think about macOS versus Windows, Windows has a lot of really mature security tools for all the, ribbing that we do about, Windows and everything else. There's a lot of really good mature security tools for it. Windows Defender is probably better than it's ever been. All the different tools, the different EDR sensors, SentinelOne, all the different ones that everybody uses, they work pretty well. So adversaries have to work really hard to evade them. On the macOS side, we do have some mature security tools, but the bare basic ones that are included with the operating system are based in Yara signatures, a little bit of behavioral signature things, but adversaries often don't have to work as hard to evade those. So they get away with a little bit more of just basic encoding. they don't have to have as much mature solutions. But on the Linux side, we see a little bit more of what we see from the Windows side. And I know Alex has a lot to say about that.
Thank you. Yes, I certainly do. So when you think about Linux, it's a little bit more of a valuable target for threat actors than macOS because Linux is often used to run servers. So there's higher value data there. They're a lot more valuable if you're a ransomware actor. So there is a little bit more of the crypto activity there, though it's still much less common in the wild than it would be on Windows. What we are seeing in the wild is modified UPX for the most part. We've seen it from Lazarus Group, Mirai, and some crypto miners, and we'll dive into that a little bit more in a sec. But there are also a bunch of GitHub projects that do not have any in the wild use confirmed, to my knowledge, such as Encrypt or Aziri. Both of these are repos that have like 200 some stars, so that makes you think that people are keeping an eye on them, but haven't confirmed that it's actually been used in the wild. And this research from the screenshot on the slide is research from the JP Cert, so thank you for their work. On the left, you can see a standard UPX packed binary. And then on the right, there's one that has been modified where the Mirai actor removes the UPX magic bytes and assigns a different value to each sample that is then like appended to the end of the file. So it then just uses this modified version to do its unpacking routine and get the real malicious code out. And I can't talk about Linux without mentioning the cloud. So again, we don't have nearly as much crypting activity on the cloud side. And that's largely because cloud services are web applications. You know, you're not necessarily working with the full OS when you're attacking a web application. So there's just a little bit less of a need for obfuscating and payloads to evade security tooling. The crypting does happen, interestingly, on the tool development side. So the actors who develop and build cloud tools will package their code and obfuscate it so that people aren't getting it for free. They bundle up the tools as executables, even though a lot of the ones I've looked at are written in Python. They could easily be run as Python scripts, and some of them are monolithic Python scripts with 10,000 lines of code. But it's ultimately source code protection. So it's a little more like when software developers, like legitimate companies, are using packers to, you know, or secure their intellectual property and deter people from reverse engineering it. One example we have here is from AlienFox, which is a cloud info stealer that works primarily through using API keys against targeted services that are largely related to sending email or SMS messages for spamming, but also some other general web server hacking. It's distributed many times by many different actors as a compiled Python executable that is then encrypted to prevent people from distributing the Python source code and being able to do it for free. But there's an active community of people who work on breaking the crypters and will then distribute the Python source code for free. In this example, this was from the sample was a very large Python script named Doctor or DR by BanCrack at ibx.py. So we see here that this actor, BanCrack, had cracked the compiled Windows executable that had been encrypted and then distributed the tool source code. And here we see the login function that was from the old licensed version where the threat actor initially was requiring people to have a valid license to use the tool. Obviously, you can bypass this at this point with the source code. Okay.
That's amazing. I loved, yeah, the talking through, seeing the license part there is kind of amazing to me. It's like you realize that everybody has their day job, including bad guys.
Exactly. We're all in this together in some ways.
Yeah, talking through the loaders, showing some of the, again, some of the data from the loader side of what we see with EDR telemetry. Again, kind of like what we see with the Crypter ecosystem. There are some loaders that don't produce a lot of EDR telemetry because maybe they have, you know, for whatever reason or another, they don't produce file modifications. They just do a single network connection or, you know, however they operate. Sometimes they leave some pretty unique command lines and have some pretty special themes that we can, you know, be able to key on. And a good example of this that's been seen recently is Oyster, or you may see some folks call it cleanup loader. This is a loader that we've seen in the last couple of months that usually masquerades as a cleanup tool. We've seen it distributed as kind of an intermediary step between some malware families, and we've also seen it be a first step in some cases where someone just distributes this cleanup DLL. And usually what ends up happening is this DLL creates some sort of persistence where it can just stay resident on the system and then periodically call home to pull down more malware. And in the examples where we saw it, we saw a lot of persistence where it was being, where it was creating scheduled tasks, as well as what you see here in the screenshot, which is Windows Start menu shortcuts in the little startup folder. And it would leave multiple persistence mechanisms. So if one got caught by a defender, it still had something to fall back on. And then, the longer you left this run DLL32 command running, the longer it would go and, download additional PowerShell, download additional executables, and be able to pull things in. So it's very much very much a business for these folks to be able to just stay resident, let's keep it going, and pull all of the data in where they can, and then try to use that. And we've seen them, pull down multiple threats in the past. And the second one I wanted to highlight was Koi Loader here. This one has been seen specifically with one threat, Koi Stealer, but I wanted to highlight this in the EDR telemetry that comes from it for a couple of reasons. Number one, because it kind of shows how easy jumping into some of the loader ecosystem is, because all it really is this kind of Rube Goldberg machine of PowerShell and JScript put together. And it also had its first stage inside a shortcut file. So in Windows, you have these shortcut LNK link files, right? So when you double click on one, it executes a command and you can go, it goes and does whatever. Most people are used to seeing their Microsoft Office shortcuts on their desktop. Well, sometimes adversaries will, make a shortcut with an interesting icon. Someone will click on it, and then it'll start executing something like this. In this case, it was masquerading as a bank statement, and then afterwards executed a PowerShell command to go and download additional content. And in reality, what we ended up getting on the end of this was a .NET-based stealer. But since this is kind of a generic enough PowerShell, this is something that could be easily repurposed and retooled. It can be other threats that come with it. All your adversary has to do is choose to do something different another day. All right. And now, moving back to the Linux side.
Thank you. So loaders on Linux, what we're seeing is a lot of living off the land, especially shell scripts. They're pretty ubiquitous. Every Linux system is going to be able to run some kind of shell commands in general. We also see them re-downloading payloads constantly because things are a little bit more ephemeral on Linux. Rather than saving them to disk, they will have a scheduled task that's repeatedly just doing the same thing over and over again, or cron job rather on Linux, of course. And then on the binary side, we're seeing so much Golang these days. It might be just the ease of programming and popularity. I don't want to give the threat actors too much credit by saying they know that reversing Go is pretty annoying. But we are seeing a whole lot of it. It's cross-platform, so Golang is certainly reigning right now. One good example that I wanted to highlight was some research done by Matt over at, I think formerly at MITRE ATT&CK. This campaign, Spinning Yarn, was targeting Confluence, Hadoop, and Redis servers, where it spawns a new container and then mounts it to root on the underlying host, and then the mount path on the container, which allows the container to then write files to the underlying host, essentially container escape. It uses that to write a binary named virl, or VURL, kind of like curl, but virl, which creates a cron job that downloads and executes a shell script from a decrypted IP address or a decrypted URL that's in some of this junk data here, or junk looking. And it does that literally every minute, just because, again, persisting on Linux is a challenge. And then on the cloud side, again, loaders in the cloud, it's a little less necessary. Of course, if your cloud service is a container or a compute instance, you do have the same attack surface as you would with a regular endpoint. So that's worth keeping in mind. But a lot of cloud services are more minimal. And again, more like web applications. So the tools that we see, as I've noted earlier, are generally abusing compromised service credentials. We have AlienFox, which was mentioned, FBot, a very similar tool. And there are tools by the Team TNT actor who has been kind of innovating in the cloud threat space since they showed up in 2018 or 2019. We'll take a look at one of those. So this is it's some code that is designed to create an HTTP request on a system that doesn't have curl or wget or something similar. And what it's doing is just crafting HTTP headers manually using bash. It's a pretty creative way, but we see other actors using this too. Like I believe I've seen Watchdog, a couple other of the coin miner cloud threat actors are using a very similar path here. And in this campaign, I believe they were using it to download a Golang binary that contained mass scan, which it was using to scan and then identify targets that had a certain Docker port open and worm its way over to infect new hosts. So are there any questions that we can answer at this point? I know I saw one from a few minutes ago asking if threat actors use RC4 mostly. I think it's pretty common, but it's just a pretty simple one to implement. Anyone else have thoughts on this?
The ones I've seen the most tend to be RC4 and AES, like 128 or 256. Those are the ones that I tend to see the most.
Yeah, well, concur with that.
I do have one question for you, Alex, because I know you mentioned the trying to keep things persistent over on Linux can be a hassle sometimes. Do you see adversaries struggle a lot with how ephemeral Docker systems like container systems can be?
Yeah, and again, I think that's why they're constantly just setting these cron jobs to re-download things, because it's ultimately more of a payoff than trying to persist on Linux, just by the way of the nature of the system. So yeah, it's definitely a struggle for them, which is good. That should be some incentive if you're running Windows Server at this point. Remember, Linux exists.
Yep, exactly. All right, so I know we have the one that took a little bit extra time on, which info stealer tends to be the least detected. The ones that tend to be least detected that I've seen in the past tend to be the ones that leave less file modifications and usually just have a single network connection going out to maybe Telegram or just a random server out in the world somewhere. The more noise it makes file and command wise, the easier it tends to be to detect, no matter which family it is. But it's seemed to me that the quieter it is, the less easily detected. All right, let's see. We have two more. Oh, and not familiar with. One person said not familiar with Golang, so that's going to be Go programming language. It's a really awesome system language where you can do some really cool network programming things. It's really easy to use, but it's also really can be really problematic. Can you elaborate a little bit on what some of the reversing looks like from the Go side?
Yeah, I can definitely elaborate on that. I'm a little bit of a notorious Go hater. So when you're reversing Golang, the binaries contain all of the libraries that Go could ever possibly need. It's just incredibly bloaty. So it also mangles a lot of the function names and the imports. So there have been a lot of strides made in recent years by the decompiler makers like IDA Pro, and then of course the Ghidra community, to make Go reversing a little bit less painful. And it has gotten a lot better, but there is still a significant amount of bloat because of all of those libraries being statically linked in there.
I know seeing there were some tools like Go Resim, I think was one where it would try to recreate symbols and structures when I discovered that existed, my life, like I got a little bit happy inside. I shouldn't have gotten as happy, but it was still a challenge, but it was interesting to see how it could be torn apart.
Exactly. And now we have Go, like, somewhat mostly sorted out. And here comes Rust. And Rust is like a whole other beast on another level for reversing. So, yeah, I would say Rust is the new Golang when it comes to being the enemy of reversers.
Yep. All right. Now, tackle one more before we head on in towards looking at the detection side a little bit. One person asked, do the loaders we see constantly or consistently bypass EDR and AV? It's kind of a mixed bag. It's very much like a case-by-case basis where some loaders will definitely bypass some AV engines, and adversaries are smart enough to know this. They'll absolutely tailor their loaders in some cases. If they specifically want to evade certain AV vendors, well, they'll do their own threat research and try to figure out, what things those AV vendors are looking for, what those EDRs are looking for. Some of them that have a little bit less activity, again, just like the Steeler stuff, if it doesn't make a lot of noise, you end up having to use other tells. Like, is it executing from suspicious folders? Is it executing in suspicious command lines? Different things like that. For the binary content inside them, with crypters and loaders, it tends to be an interesting cat and mouse game where they'll flip a few bytes here, and then after the bytes are flipped, AV can catch up to it, and it just takes a little bit for AV to get there. But again, it is entirely vendor dependent. Some vendors are really awesome at it, some aren't. It just depends on that cat and mouse game. All right, so go ahead and dive on into the detection side. So I believe you were doing the first. Were you doing the first slide on this one, Alex? I cannot recall.
I can. So detection is definitely it varies depending on each implementation for both crypters and loaders. It's not going to be a one size fits all approach. You're going to have to look at how it's done. Just like I mentioned earlier with MITRE, where it's modifying UPX and then moving those bytes to the end, somebody else might have a different technique. Maybe they move it to like the start of another file section. So again, we've been referring to the too many pieces in motion makes it more likely that something will fail. That also means that having more moving parts will give us more chances to detect something. So use these opportunities. When you notice something is highly complex, try to look at what type of activity is occurring at each step in that chain to increase your chances of being able to write a good signature for it. And again, static signatures are sometimes ineffective, especially with things like crypters. You're going to probably have better luck looking at things and how they run on the command line or what other binaries and utilities are being called. So just keep that in mind. Try to look at all your resources when implementing detection for these.
And talking about the ones that have a lot of moving parts, what we've ended up seeing a lot is the ones that have moving parts end up using things like auto IT or auto hotkey or some of those really popular tools in the middle of all of that. And it's been really beneficial for us to try to find like suspicious use of auto IT, simply because that the auto IT stuff, it is used by systems administrators, it is used by IT admins, but it's usually used in specific ways. It's usually, run from folders where you can tell like this systems admin is running from like C tools or something like that, running from their own environment. Whereas adversaries like to sometimes try to hide their runtimes. They'll try to hide their auto IT stuff or deliver it in weird ways, like the crypter stuff we looked at earlier. And when we started kind of trying to figure out a little bit more about detecting suspicious instances of auto IT, that also helped us go chase after different malware families. So it helped us catch more Cypher IT. It also helped us catch more things like Darkgate. And there are some additional malware families. I think one was like Miss Padu that largely affected Latin American areas. So it's focusing on one specific chain in the entire ecosystem here, one specific link in the chain can help you be able to pull apart additional threats. So it's almost kind of a, finding one small link can help you identify other chains sort of activity. And depending on your org, any use of some of these tools may be suspicious, kind of like how, I've heard people suggest in the past to catch lateral movement, focus on ps-exec. In some environments, ps-exec is, something that's not used a lot. It's the same sort of situation with auto IT. In a lot of environments, your admins may not use this. If so, that's something you could potentially look into. And the other thing to really focus on that I usually suggest is talking about targeting living off the land binaries or lol bins. As you saw with the cleanup loader, the Oyster stuff earlier, that was using run-dll32 and scrub crypt and koi loader. Both of those were using PowerShell in some sense. And one of the things I usually tell people is to take a look into some of the publicly available Sigma rules around living off the land binaries. Because there's quite a few rules and there are so many ways to use some of these lol bins that it's extremely difficult to try to have detection rules to cover every little use. So exploring just generic detection around evil use of PowerShell or suspicious run DLL32 command lines, things like those, run DLL executing DLLs from suspicious locations. Some of those Sigma rules will help you go a long way in tackling some of these threats at, as early in the chain as possible. And big reason, again, they like living off the land because these tools are already on the system. They don't have to deliver as much as early in the chain. Right? And floating about Linux, so I know some of the static stuff gets interesting.
Yeah, so on the Linux side, and this, probably also applies to a lot of cloud services because what is the cloud other than someone else's computer? We see, again, a lot of the modified UPX packing, which gives you a detection opportunity via Yara. JP-Cert had provided some Yara SIGs that detect that modified Mirai variant that I talked about. But you could also just look through, even for the strings, UPX. There's a copyright string that appears in traditional or standard UPX packed binaries. You'll also see a lot of weird base64 operations with stuff that's been kind of encoded or obfuscated on the Linux side. So always look for that. I mean, it's tried and true. It's kind of pedestrian. We've all seen it, but it's really what is being used for the most part. As we noted, there's a lot of downloading and just kind of continuous activity because of the lack of the ephemeral nature of Linux. So look for downloads, especially of shell scripts or things that are then executed like a shell script, even if they're not named as such. And then lastly, keep an eye on new containers being spawned in general, especially for sensitive environments. And look for the mounting followed by file write, because that's going to be a container escape, which can cause some considerable damage depending on what the environment is like. All right. Thank you, everyone. Let's go through some of the other questions that we got.
And while we're looking, I like that you mentioned the base64 portion, because that's something we've ended up looking for a lot on PowerShell code as well. It's something that's, good across platform. If you have a way of looking for base64 encoding in, PowerShell and Python and the different languages as they're being used, that's something that seems like it gets, great returns fairly well. Absolutely.
And I know some SIMs are now automatically deobfuscating or decoding some SIMs are automatically decoding base64 when you get an alert now. So if you have a tool that can do that automatically, it'll probably make your life a lot easier when finding badness.
That's so cool. So some of the questions that we got, we do have one what would be the most effective to detect RC4 AES payloads delivered by loaders? So I know there are ways to detect those algorithms being used in things like Yara rules, where like you can have you can recognize those patterns, but I'm not entirely sure from other perspectives. I know from like network perspectives and different things like that, they would have high entropies potentially, but all of that would potentially be shielded by SSL or TLS depending on how they're downloaded as well. Do y'all have thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's pretty much where things reside. Like on the network side of things, I think there are options, but like you said, SSL throws up one barrier. The other barrier is that then you would have to carve the PE file or whatever file content out of a stream using Zeek, and then process that PE using Python like PE utils, or I can't even remember what the libraries are right now. And you can then do an examination for section and overall binary entropy that can identify if something's been encrypted or not. But as one might be able to infer from the length of my answer so far, there is a little bit of plumbing that goes into that, and certain things can break that pretty easily depending upon what sort of visibility you have. So it's not impossible. It's just not easy.
Yeah, and I think one thing you can look for that's a very, very, very low fidelity indicator, but just if you're reversing a binary, you can look for libraries that are associated with crypto, like OpenSSL. You'll see them in a lot of binaries. In .NET, you'll see like the Rindale managed for AES. So yeah, just keep an eye out for the crypto libraries, but it's far from an indicator of maliciousness. It just might hint that there is some cryptographic activity occurring.
Yeah,
I
and even
love
from a
that.
manual side of things, the lack of observations, which is not something that you could easily write an automated detection for, but from an interactive analysis perspective can be insightful as well. Like, why does this not have any human readable strings? Or why does this only have like one or two imported functions or whatever? And that's because things are generally being packed and defended against or whatever. And you've at least answered one question, but do you have someone's downloading a game with extensive copy and reversing protection, or is someone downloading malware? Like, that's still an open question at that point.
I like that. And the talking about how the absence of some activity and how like some of that visibility decreases, where that's really struck me has been with like sandbox technologies of like trying to run malware in sandboxes. And there are some times where a sandbox will just throw up its hands and go, there's nothing here. And it's kind of a fascinating thing to me because like sometimes a sandbox will be able to read those TLS connections and be able to carve out those payloads, and then for some sites it can't, and it's magnifying that times 100 is the defender problem. Sweet. All right, so we had one additional question. How would you classify Chrome Loader and frameworks that use browser plugins? Is there good telemetry? So sharing a little bit of what we've seen from the EDR side at Red Canary has been Chrome Loader type threats tend to leave some file modifications that are, I don't want to say necessarily easy to zoom in on, but they're you can definitely tell that they're browser extensions. They'll have different JS extensions on them, and they'll be written in certain paths on disk. And potentially, depending on how the Chrome Loader variant is doing its thing, they'll also have a detection, or they'll also have a command that gets issued where Chrome has a -- load extension command put onto the end of it. That's something that we actually see very commonly. Like we see a lot of Chrome Loader on a weekly, monthly basis. For the classification type stuff, I tend to personally look at it as falling into that loader thing because it seems like it's trying to deliver its payloads, even though it's a little bit more potentially unwanted software versus something that's immediately a rat or immediately something that's a stealer. What thoughts do y'all have on stuff like that?
I mean, a loader is a loader, and I think Chrome loader certainly falls into that activity. It's interesting that it's going through the browser side where EDR, like, admittedly has a little bit less visibility than it would if you're attacking the system itself. So it's a pretty clever technique. It's a loader.
Awesome. So one good question: how do y'all feel about using machine learning to detect loaders? And I might extend that just a little bit to ask, how do you feel about machine learning or generative AI? The Gen AI wasn't in the question, but I feel like that's an easy pivot to talk about.
Are we like rated G, PG, or where are we at here in terms of?
let's not get demonetized.
I'm kidding. But there's definitely a space for this when you talk about improving maybe the velocity of analysis by taking in given inputs and running it through a classifier and trying to figure out how this aligns with a known corpus of samples. So there's definitely applications for this. And I think we've seen elements of this in the anti-malware space for a while now. You know, there's been companies that have, this is not new. The folks have been poking at this, going all the way back to my time at the Department of Energy 10 years ago now. You know, people were toying around with machine learning mechanisms to identify things like malicious software based upon different functionality aspects, or chunking them into different sizable bytes for making sort of like unit level signatures for different portions or whatever of the file, and all sorts of other things. And you start throwing crypters and whatnot into the question, and it would break some of that functionality, which in and of itself is a signal that, oh, I have a self-defending binary. That is a sign. If I can add context around that elsewhere, like where did it come from, I can start dispositioning that as malicious or not, or potentially malicious or not. So I think this is definitely something where there is promise. It's not new. I would stress as well, it's become more popular lately, that's for sure, with the generative AI boom right now. But it really taps into lines of work that have been ongoing for quite some time, and entire companies built around these sorts of ideas as well.
I only have like a little bit to add on there. I think that you know, I've talked to a lot of people about ML over the years, and it sounded like there was a lot of like interest and promise in function hashing, and I would like to see a lot more of that happening, because I think it would apply to loaders, but certainly for crypters, because when we have a packer or a crypter, you know, there's probably going to be a repeated function or routine that happens near the entry point that you could then sig on, and that would just make detection so much easier. So yeah, let's do it.
100%.
One of the things that kind of fascinates me about stuff like that, I remember reading a post recently from, I think, the Google and Mandiant folks talking about using their Gemini AI for malware analysis stuff. And I'm kind of interested to see where it goes. Like, I know some people are kind of in that boat of let's just throw AI and let's just throw in AI and let AI disposition. Is it evil or is it not? What I'm really excited about is sort of seeing the ways that we can use like the outputs from triage and processing a lot better. Where, like, you know, as an industry, it seems like we're at that place of like, you have to use your own expertise, but you have to build that expertise a little bit as you go. It would be so wonderful and so nice if there was a way to like combine all of that expertise together so that it can help you interpret malware reports and things like that. I'm excited to see where that goes. So, sweet. All right. So I think that is what we have in the way of questions. Is there anything else any other departing wisdom that y'all want to leave our viewers with?
Sure. So loaders and crypters are not the sexiest items in the room, perhaps, but they are of vital importance for a number of threat actors to enable and further their objectives. So while it might not seem like, oh, we're just talking about a loader that loads an info stealer, that's pretty important. And understanding that the importance of these tools, where they reside within adversary operations, and the difficulties that can be imposed on adversaries by effectively identifying or blocking these items are non-trivial. And so these are definitely items to be considered, and where folks can usefully spend a pretty good deal of effort on.
Awesome. Yeah, and I especially like talking like the mix and match component. The more it's becoming more common every day, it's really it's disheartening to see in a way, but it's interesting to see how things have evolved, how it in some ways like seeing that cat and mouse thing can show like vendors and security solutions kind of can up their game as well, like exploring things that they didn't know were possible just because adversaries found them first and being able to kind of pull that stuff in. Awesome. Well, I believe that's what we have in the way of content today. Thanks everybody for joining in. You should have your resources stuff again in the pane that's in your webinar console, and you should get a recording from this soon. Thanks everyone for joining.